Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. The Woman in the Mirror. My family had just moved into this house from a different part of town. It didn't seem strange just driving by. Once I came in and got settled, I began to hear strange noises, as if someone were walking around the ceiling in my room. The entrance to the attic was on the outside of the house, so I thought that it was probably just an animal that had wandered into the opening. The next day I went up to get whatever it was out so I could get some sleep the next night. I didn't really believe in ghosts before this event occurred, but since then my ideas about the supernatural have changed drastically. As I walked up the stairs, I got a really cold feeling, and then I smelled the scent of antiquity. This surprised me because it was the middle of August, and it definitely isn't that cold in the south. I heard a voice, and it told me that it wanted my family to leave. I thought it was just my imagination and tried to find the source of the noise that had kept me awake. I came upon a large wooden mirror. In it I could see my length and the rest of the room behind me. And then that cool feeling came back, and I felt a cold, clammy sensation on my neck. I just stared into the mirror, and behind me appeared a woman. She was very beautiful, but she held a look of sadness that I had never seen before. I wasn't afraid. She then spoke to me, saying we had to leave before her husband came home. I told her that the only man here was my father. Then from out of nowhere came a sudden gust of wind and a dark cloud. I turned to look at her again, but she was gone. I encountered her several more times, and each time she told me the same thing. Never was I afraid of her, but each time she left, the same dark cloud came and a bad smell. I was out in the garden one night with a few close friends when she came running from the house. I was sure of my sanity then because everyone else saw it as well. She was wringing her hands and opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I did some research at the local library. It turned out that our house once belonged to Richard and Elizabeth Montgomery in the early 1900s. Richard murdered Elizabeth and then shot himself. He thought that she had an affair with his brother, and anger got the best of him. To make a long story short, we had the house blessed, and every once in a while, I still get a visit from her. But she seems happier now. The evil spirit is gone. I hope she can find peace at last. The Haunted Basement. Today you hear many stories of ghosts and the supernatural. I never paid much attention to ghost stories until my sister and her boyfriend had an experience that almost makes my skin crawl. They both saw a ghostly spirit in the same place on the same eerie night. Sister Annie and her boyfriend Mike were staying at my father's house in Indiana. It's an older house, I would say about 50 years old, and the basement was the only place in the house that had room for Annie and Mike to sleep. The basement is old with concrete floors and has no ceiling. When you look up, you can see the water pipes and any other kind of piping the house has. It is really kind of creepy. The smell is musty and it feels damp. There are only 4 rooms down there: a junk room, which is never opened up, the washer and dryer room, a bedroom which has a wooden door with vents, and just an old den that has no use now. When you are down there, you can hear everything going on upstairs, and you can hear the furnace kick on and off, which is really kind of spooky. One cold winter night, Annie and Mike were going to bed. They went down the stairs and into the bedroom. They made sure to shut the door behind them, so that if someone came down to do laundry, the door would keep some sound out. They crawled into bed and slowly drifted off to sleep. Annie recalls about 3 hours later thinking someone was standing over her. She rolled over onto her back and opened her eyes. Much to her surprise stood an old man with overalls on and an old farmer's cap standing by the bed staring at her. She started to kick the covers off of her because she wanted out of that room quick. She was frightened so bad that she couldn't scream or make any kind of sounds. She says when she started kicking, the man just stepped back to the wall, but was still staring at her. She ran directly past him, opened the door, went upstairs, and got our dad. My dad came down to check it out, while in the meantime Mike slept through the whole situation. When my dad flipped on all the lights, there was no one in sight. Naturally, it took my sister a while to be able to go back to sleep, but she finally did. Well, about an hour later, Mike woke up and rolled over towards the door, which was shut, and he saw a woman's figure. He thought the woman was our stepmom, so he spoke out, "Sherry, what are you doing down here this late?" The figure just floated off into the vented door. He then realized the figure was not our stepmom, but a ghost. He woke my sister up and told her what had just happened. With no hesitance, they both went upstairs and slept at the foot of our father's bed. The only thing we can figure out is that these lost spirits were looking for one another. Maybe they had unfinished business to do when they died, or maybe they never got to tell each other goodbye and they are stuck between worlds. You never know. But I do know that I believe in lost spirits now. I believe that if someone passes away in a sudden death, they do not really realize that they are dead, so their bodies float around trying to take care of things that were left undone. I believe when the lost spirit or ghost is at peace with himself, he will pass to another world. The footsteps. I used to live in a house that was about 90 years old. The only people that had ever inhabited the house were members of my stepfather's family, and nobody had ever died in the house. When I was about 10, my mother used to tell my sister and I that she had heard somebody walking around the ground floor of our 2-story house. Neither my sister, who is 2 years younger than myself, or I had been up the previous night. No explanation could be found. When I was 14, my youngest sister was born, and this is when what I call the haunting really intensified. Both my younger sister and I heard somebody walking around the house, both on the stairs to the second floor, as well as the stairs to the basement. During this time, we both had bedrooms on the ground floor. We never actually heard anything on the ground floor, just on the staircases to both of the other floors. Not long after this, I was laying in my bed trying to get to sleep one night. My older sister had a bedroom opposite my own with a bathroom in between us. There was a door from either bedroom to the bathroom. I heard the door on her side open, footsteps, and then the door on my side open. I also heard very distinctive footsteps on my floor. The floor always creaked when anybody walked across it. I assumed that my younger sister had a nightmare or something and had come into my room to sleep as she had done many times in the past. I heard 4 or 5 footsteps, then nothing. I waited and waited and waited, fully expecting her to say something to me along the lines of, "I can't sleep. Can I sleep in here?" Nothing came. I finally rolled over and saw somebody dressed in a flowing white gown standing about 15 feet from my bedside. I have poor eyesight, and at the time wore glasses exclusively. I still assumed this to be my sister and said something to the effect of, "What, you can't sleep? You can stay in here if you want to." I then waited, and the person said nothing to me, just stood there. I thought that my sister was either sleepwalking or didn't want to wake our parents by saying anything, so I rolled over again. I waited about a minute, then rolled over, and there was nobody there. I heard no footsteps leaving the room. I got out of bed, walked over to my sister's room, and found her sound asleep in her bed, and she was not wearing anything even remotely close to what the figure I saw in my room had been wearing. Needless to say, I did not sleep very much the rest of the night. Once my youngest sister was around 1, I volunteered to move into the basement while my older sister remained on the ground floor. My youngest sister took over the room that my older sister had been in, and she in turn took my old bedroom. Not long after this, my mother revealed to us that She had seen several green lights floating around my baby sister's bedroom. No source for the lights could be found or explained. The footsteps continued to be heard by all members of the family, and my older sister and myself were still being blamed for this. When my youngest sister turned 2, I was 16 at the time, she started telling everyone that she wanted the man in her room to leave. Nobody besides myself, as far as I know, ever saw anybody in the house that shouldn't be there. Yet, my youngest sister constantly complained about the man in her room, and she wanted him to leave. One of the worst episodes I ever experienced in this house is when I was about 17 and my younger sister was 15. We were sitting watching TV in the living room, and nobody else was home. The main entrance to our house was off of the kitchen, where you would walk through the door, then through a pair of bar-style doors into the kitchen. We both very distinctly heard the main door open and close, the bar-style doors swing open and close, then somebody walk across the kitchen floor into the dining room. The entire ground floor creaked when you walked on it. There was absolutely no mistaking somebody walking on the ground floor. We both assumed it was our mother coming home that evening, and both of us called out, "Mom!" No answer. Again with "Mom!" and again no answer. We then walked out of the living room into the kitchen and looked around. Nobody to be seen. I then walked to the front door, and the chain lock on the door was in place, and the door was locked. Still nobody anywhere in the house. My sister was still in the kitchen when I went into the aforementioned bathroom between the 2 bedrooms on the ground floor. I turned on the light, looked around, found nobody in either the bedroom or the bathroom, then turned off the light. Only the light would not turn off. The lights dimmed to about 50% luminosity, even though the switch was completely off. The lights in this bathroom never did this before, nor did they ever do it again. My sister and I, finding nobody in the house, decided it was probably a good time to leave and got out of the house as quickly as possible. Now, the worst episode in the house came when I was 19. My younger sister was 17, and she had a friend living in the house of the same age. Her friend had a Ouija board, and for fun, they pulled it out and asked who the cause of the haunting was. The board came up with the answer of Brad, our stepfather. Then on its own, without any prompting, said, "Get out." Very short, very simple. We moved out of the house not long after this episode, and the house and grounds have been sold and bulldozed. There is now a major hardware store sitting on the site. I can't wait to hear what anyone who works there has to say. Staying on the ghost's good side. My story starts when I was 19 years old. I started dating a guy who was in the U.S. Navy and attached to a submarine station out of Virginia. He was one of the nicest fellows I had ever dated at that time. He treated me like a lady, and I fell in love with him, and we were married within the year. The first time he took me over to his house, which was actually owned by his parents who lived out of state. He had been to sea for a couple of weeks, and the house had been closed up for that length of time. When he unlocked the door and walked in, he said, "Hello, house, I'm home." Now, I never thought he was strange, but at that moment I thought he had lost his mind. I asked him why he had said that, and his response was that the house was haunted, and he wanted to stay on the ghost's good side. I, at this point, didn't know what to think. The story he told me about his first experience was interesting. He had been out partying with some friends and came home a bit in the bag. He went to sleep and later woke up hearing something breathing heavily. He thought, okay, I've been drinking and I'm probably hearing myself breathe, or maybe I was snoring. He then held his breath for a minute, but the breathing did not stop. He jumped out of bed, threw his clothes on, and drove the hour or so to the Norfolk Navy base to spend the night on his submarine. He later returned home thinking that it was because he had been drinking that he had thought he had heard the breathing. Not so. Things started to disappear and turn up much later in the strangest places. Sometimes he would get a feeling of approval from somewhere if he was doing something domestic such as sewing, hash marks, or patches on his uniforms. I know that sounds strange, but I believed him. After all, this man had a mind like an engineer. You know, they don't believe in anything that they can't see or touch. He never would have even mentioned it if he wasn't convinced that he had a ghost. Anyway, to get on with my story of the house. Really, nothing happened at first that was unnerving. I thought that maybe it really was a figment of his imagination. However, when he went to see for the first time and I was alone in the house, I found out differently. First, let me say that I never saw anything weird in the house. No ghosts floating down the hall or standing over me. There were, however, several cold spots in the house that were so cold that it was like stepping into a freezer. I would go to sleep at night and leave a brush or a teacup on the bedside table only to awake in the morning and find them gone. This drove me nuts because I knew that no one else was in the house with me. The only time I was really frightened was when the power would go off during a storm. I would get on the phone with anyone who would keep me company until the lights came on again. One night, while I was on the phone with my girlfriend's mother, my friend wasn't at home and I decided that her mother would do just fine keeping me company. I heard the ringing of small bells coming from the other room. My husband's parents had 2 small poodles, and when they came to visit, had left the dog's toys behind. The toys consisted of a woman's stocking, which had been knotted with a small bell attached to it. The dogs loved to play with these. I had just cleaned the family room that day, and while dusting had seen the toys sitting on an end table. I know that I left them there. When the lights came back on, they were on the other side of the room on the floor. The strangest thing happened one night when I had invited a friend and her boyfriend over for dinner. She and I had known each other for years and had never had a problem communicating. It turned into one of the most strange evenings I have ever had to get through. She and I could hardly talk to each other. I kept wondering what I had done to tick her off. Her boyfriend was also very reserved, which was not at all like him. I decided to muddle through the evening and hope that I could figure out what the problem was later. The next day she called to see if I was all right. She said that while she was there, that she felt something evil or at the least angry about the house. This was the first time she had been there. I guess I should say that the house was only about 10 years old at the time. Strange age for a haunted house. She had gone home that night and had an awful feeling that something bad was going to happen. She even called her boyfriend to see if he was all right. He was just about ready to call her to see if she was okay. She was so upset that she carried a weapon with her for about a week, not understanding what her premonition meant. She finally admitted to me that she would never come into that house again and that I shouldn't stay there when my husband was at sea. I thought she had lost her mind, since I really had never felt threatened except when the power went out at night. My husband came home from sea and we found out that I was expecting our first child. At first nothing really happened, but then it started. Fortunately, my husband never told me the things that were going on until he convinced me to move to our own apartment. I kept thinking, why should we move from a 3-bedroom home with everything I could ever want and move into an apartment? His excuse finally was that his parents wanted to sell the house and we would have to move. Once we moved, he would never let me go back in. Finally, I found out why. When he was home from sea, he would get up very early in the morning to get ready to go to work at the Navy base. I would stay in bed. He finally told me that when he would get up in the morning, that he would go into the kitchen to turn on the coffee. He looked into the dining room and all of the chairs which had been pushed up to the table would all be rearranged all over the room. He, of course, would put them back where they belonged and not tell me. He also would find eggs broken in the sink. Things that had been put up the night before were again out on the kitchen counter. Also, things were rearranged in the family room. The strange thing to him was that everything that was rearranged were things that I had owned when we got married. Nothing of his or his parents, who had graciously furnished the house, was moved. This worried him, since none of this had started before I got pregnant. After we moved, we would go back to check the house. Again, he would not let me go into the house. The house was on the market and the furniture had been left there until it sold. He would find everything in disarray. The realtor would call from time to time, complaining that she couldn't get into the house. The key wouldn't work. She wanted to know if we had changed the locks. To make a long story shorter than I might if I kept on rambling, we did some research on the house. Now remember that the house was only about 10 years old. What we found out was the original owner's wife had died from some sort of cancer that she had been battling for years. This cancer evidently prevented her from having children. We were told that she had wanted a large family. My husband thinks that when I became pregnant, that this woman's ghost was jealous and somehow would have injured me or our son if we had stayed. I had my doubts, since I had never really felt threatened while in the house, except when the lights went out. I found out later that my husband had premonitions that came true. He told me that one day that he was going to die young. He took out extra life insurance so that our son and I wouldn't have to worry about anything. 6 months later, he was dead from a freak accident at work that could not have been predicted. I still wonder if he was right about my being in danger because I was pregnant. Did she want our child, or did she want to prevent the birth of our child? I will never know the answer to that question. I keep wanting to go back to the house and ask the present owners if they had experienced anything strange in the house. I have never had the nerve. It has been 25 years since I lived there, and sometimes I think that it was just an overactive imagination, and then I remember what really took place there. The uncle's ghost. I dated my wife in the mid-1980s and we married in 1995. During that time, my wife's family lived in a house way out in the country. All the times I took her home, she never invited me in. I thought it was me. But there is another explanation. Before they moved into it, this house had been vacant for about 3 years. Perhaps this is the reason why. One morning, my wife said she awoke from spending the night on the couch. She got up to use the bathroom and returned to the couch and laid down. She then heard bells tinkling, which seemed to be moving towards her. She felt a presence in the room, a bad one, and she looked up far enough to see what appeared to be the legs of one of her uncles named Victor. The thing was being mean to her verbally, only it was speaking extremely fast and nonsensical. It was speaking in gibberish as far as she was concerned. She ran to her parents' bedroom and told them about the incident and how the thing reminded her of Victor. Her mother got on the phone and called Victor in California to try to settle her down and show her that it was all right. Things weren't quite right for some time after that in that house. These encounters happened about once every 5 weeks for 5 years. Always it began with the sound of bells. When she heard the bells, she knew she was in trouble. The entity seemed to get off on her fear. It would enter the room and ring bells over her head, sometimes small tinkling bells and sometimes loud cowbells. It would laugh at her in an evil way. It got to the stage where it would touch her, pushing her down into the couch with enough force to hold her there so she couldn't move. One time she said it pushed the back of her head into the couch till it felt like my face would rip, and put something that felt and sounded like a power drill into the back of her head. On one occasion it tried to pick her up off the bed. She felt arms go under her neck and knees. She prayed like a maniac, and it finally left her alone. No one really believed her when she told them what was going on. A particular friend of hers didn't believe her until she spent the night in the house. She woke up in the bedroom to the sound of bells and saw 3 men at the foot of the bed laughing at her. She got up and ran to her car and left the scene. She would never enter the house again. But she believed. One of my sister-in-laws was up early one morning making lunch for a school outing. She went into the other room to eat a bowl of cereal and watch TV, but kept hearing a scraping sound. She thought that it was one of the family in the kitchen and went back to doing her thing. When she went into the kitchen, she saw that all the chairs had been moved into the center of the room. She woke the whole family up. No one was up at that time. She then believed as well. Most of the family recalls being in the TV room where most of the activity happened and getting the feeling that something was in the room with them. Sometimes everything was fine, and then all of a sudden the room got a heavy, weird feeling. No one in her church would believe her either. She told them on several occasions, and they attributed it to the imagination of a 17-year-old. Finally, they ended up accepting the fact. You see, there was another woman down the road, about half a mile away, that was having the same trouble. The reason that they believed it from her is because her husband saw the thing pick her up once. It seems that the skeptics needed another witness. After the house was blessed, they had no more visits from the unknown entity. The Confederacy Ghosts. Let's see, it had to be almost a year ago since it happened. My name is Mike, and for the past couple of years, a group of my friends and I began night patrolling Civil War battlefields in Central Virginia. We were hired to watch out for relic hunters and things out of the ordinary on these historic sites. Anyway, like I was saying, in the first couple of weeks in September of 1995, my co-workers and I were called out to do a late patrol around the Five Forks and Cold Harbor areas. It was about 2 a.m. We got a call over the radio about figures in one of the battlefields nearby, so me and my partner take the call. We get to the entrance, hop out of my truck, and look around. I guess we spent 7 or 10 minutes out in the cold. Then we heard a sound of people running into the woods from the center of the field. The sound was very clear considering there were no other sounds. It was the dead of night. The figures appeared to us off in the distance, and we yelled for them to stop. With no sign of their acknowledging us, we radioed for help, and it arrived instantly. We instructed them to wait at the entrance while we drove around to the backside of the park to cut the figures off. On the way to do so, we saw a white haze. I was thinking nothing more than maybe it was snow falling from the trees, and I wanted to continue, but my partner, who had become frantic by this point, demanded for me to stop. Not knowing why, I killed the headlights and pulled into the side entrance for the park officials and then turned off the engine. It grew really quiet again, and it was like that for about 5 minutes, and then we saw yellowish orange flashes off in the distance. I knew that they were musket flashes. Having never seen them before, only hearing local legends, my heart began to race, and I got out of my truck. My partner, scared out of his mind, got out also. The closer we walked towards the center of the field, the flashes became more and more obvious. We began to hear deep rumbling booms. Just as fast as it had started, it ended, and then it became deathly quiet again. A quiet I had never known up till that point. Then we began to hear grunts, clanking metal, coming from the mist, and then we began to hear the sound of steps, many steps, slow ones and quick ones, and we heard the snow crunch underneath them. As the mist grew closer, we could make out figures of mounted men dressed in gray of Civil War military. As one became visible, more became visible, and more. They stopped moving. My partner and I were witnessing a cavalry of spirits before our eyes. We looked at them, and they looked at us, and we could not move. Then someone called on the radio for me from the front of the park, and as I went for it, one of the spirits yelled, "Stop right there!" So I did, nearly to the point of crapping all over myself. 5 of the figures rode up to me. 4 of the spirits stayed back about 15 feet, and one rode directly up to me. He climbed off his horse and approached me. He looked me straight in the face and glanced at my partner, then looked back at me, peered over the left shoulder of my jacket, which had a Confederate battle flag patch sewn on the sleeve. The spirit looked back up at me, mounted his horse, and rode back to the others along with the 4 that rode over to us with him. The spirit looked back one last time, and the cavalry rode off and vanished. We walked over to where they were, and no hoofprints or footprints were to be found. And we could never explain that episode of the ghostly cavalry. The upstairs hallway. When I was very young, I slept in a bedroom upstairs, but I have since then moved to the basement because it terrifies me to walk down the stairs from my bedroom to the main floor. When I was young, I thought for sure that Dracula was standing on the upstairs landing staring at me as I went down the stairs. It was like he was silently threatening to jump on my back and suck all the blood from my body and leave me dying and watching in vain while he killed the rest of my family. That's the closest I can come to explaining the feeling descending the stairs gave me. But what was I supposed to do? My bedroom was up there. I suppose I could have slept on the couch, but I still would have to go upstairs because the only bathroom was up there. So my only solution was to go down the stairs with my back to the wall so I could see both ways. One night, when I was about 13 years old, I woke to see either a woman or a man with long blonde hair sitting on the floor with his back to the wall opposite my bed. I closed my eyes and opened them again. The figure had vanished. This time I wasn't scared at all. My father told me about a time when he was sitting in the living room reading. It was about 3 a.m. and everyone else was asleep. My dad said he felt a sudden freeze come over his body and he couldn't move. Then he heard a shrill scream coming from the top of the stairs. At this point, he must have blacked out or something because the next thing he remembers, he is waking up the next morning in his bed upstairs. When I was 15, my family renovated the basement so that I could sleep down there. I left the upstairs with a smile on my face, never to return. But I got the feeling that whatever was in the house, at least part of what's in my house, has moved to the basement with me. This is okay with me, though, because as of yet, whatever is down there has not scared me at all. It even makes me feel safe somehow. The reason I think that something may have followed me downstairs is this. A, my room is next to the laundry room. There are 2 entrances to the laundry room. One is through my room and the other is next to the stairs leading to the main floor. The doors to the laundry room are always open. I'll close one, walk into the next room, come back, and the door will be open. The only time they, as in the ghosts, will allow the door to remain shut is when I am sleeping. And even then, it is only the door in my room that stays shut. So tell me, what in God's name is in my house? Why do they force their attention on me? How do I get rid of them? What happened in my house to warrant such activity? I don't know if I'll ever get the answer to those questions. Camp Zama. During the 1980s, I was stationed as a chaplain assistant at the U.S. Army post of Camp Zama, Japan. The Army post is a small one, 25 miles southwest of Tokyo. Before being an American Army post, it was a Japanese Army post. For a brief period, it was also contained the Emperor's horse stables. At the end of World War II, in order to save face, many Japanese officers committed suicide on the post. Also, the Emperor's horse stables burnt down, killing all the horses and the caretaker and his wife. The American military, who won the war, came in and rebuilt the post, including the American Army Chapel. As time went by, the history of the post was forgotten. I worked in the chapel. We had 5 chaplain assistants, 4 chaplains, and 4 Japanese nationals working in the chapel and adjacent offices. We never saw what was haunting the chapel, but you could definitely feel the hatred towards us Americans. The Japanese nationals said they never felt anything and would work by themselves in the building. The Americans were always feeling someone standing next to them with hatred directed towards them. Or we would be working at our desk and just know someone was standing there watching us, wanting us to go away. It wasn't until some of us decided to look up the history of Camp Zama that we learned of all the suicides and deaths. Also, when the Americans won the war and started sending troops over to Camp Zama, the troops brought their families. There was no room for the families to build houses, so the Americans moved a Japanese cemetery and built American housing at the American military housing complex known as Sagamihara. Numerous times people saw lights moving between the houses and heard invisible people rummaging around their houses. It would seem that the dead Japanese military from World War II don't like the enemy who won coming into their military posts and Americanizing things. The invisible hatred directed towards some of the Americans was very real. The dead Japanese also don't seem to appreciate having their final resting places moved. I can't say I blame them.